He was humiliated in front of his entire class by a teacher who told him he would never rise. For years, those cruel words haunted him. But instead of breaking, he turned the pain into power. Morning sunlight spilled weakly through the dusty classroom windows, painting streaks of pale gold across the wooden desks. 11-year-old Daniel tightened his grip on his books, as if they could shield him from what was about to come. Every step into that classroom felt heavier than the last, as though the floorboards themselves resisted his presence. For most children, school was a place of growth and discovery, but for Daniel, it had become a theater of humiliation. He knew the script, and he knew his role. The boy meant to fail. Mr. Crowder, the teacher who commanded the class with sharp authority, stood by the blackboard with an expression that combined boredom and cruelty. His gaze swept across the room until it landed on Daniel. A thin smile flickered across his lips, the kind that never reached his eyes. He enjoyed these moments, the moments where he could turn a lesson into a spectacle, one student's mistake into the entertainment of many, and Daniel, as always, was the easiest target. "Daniel!" he called, his voice booming against the silence. "Why don't you come and show us what you've learned? Or haven't you learned at all?" The boy's legs felt like stone as he walked toward the front. Behind him, he heard muffled snickers from classmates. He wanted to believe they weren't laughing at him, but deep down, he knew they were waiting for him to stumble, to falter, to give Crowder the show he always delivered. With trembling fingers, Daniel picked up the piece of chalk, his palms slick with sweat. He faced the problem written on the board. Numbers and symbols blurred together like ink bleeding on paper. He blinked hard, trying to steady his breath, but his heart pounded too loudly in his ears. The silence of the classroom pressed down on him like a weight he could not lift. Seconds stretched into eternities. Daniel raised the chalk, hesitated, and lowered it again. That pause, that single fatal hesitation, was enough. Crowder strode forward, snatched the chalk from his hand, and in 3 swift strokes, filled the board with the correct answer. He turned on Daniel with a sneer sharp enough to cut glass. "Pathetic," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You see, class, this is exactly why some people will never rise above their station. They don't think, they don't learn, and they never will." The words rang out, cruelly clear, echoing through the walls and straight into Daniel's chest. Laughter erupted. It was not the kind of laughter born of joy, but of cruelty, of superiority, of a group delighted to witness the spectacle of another's suffering. Daniel stood frozen, his eyes burning, but no tears fell. He refused to give Crowder that victory. His throat tightened, his stomach knotted, and yet he stood still, silent, absorbing every insult like a sponge soaks up water. The teacher turned back to the class, satisfied, moving on as though he had not just shattered the spirit of a child. To him, it was a routine, a performance he relished. When Daniel finally returned to his seat, his classmates whispered behind their hands, some glancing at him with pity, others smirking openly. The lesson continued, but Daniel could hear nothing. The words, "You'll never rise," repeated in his head, over and over, louder than the chalk screeching on the board. That day, something shifted inside him. Humiliation was supposed to break him. Instead, beneath the shame, a seed of defiance began to take root. He would not cry, he would not surrender, and he would never forget. That moment of public shame had carved a scar on his soul. But scars, as he would one day learn, were not just reminders of pain, they were blueprints for strength. In the weeks and months that followed, humiliation became Daniel's unwelcome companion. Mr. Crowder never missed an opportunity to belittle him. If Daniel answered quickly, it was called luck. If he stumbled, it was called proof. The teacher's mockery extended beyond academics. His voice, his clothes, even his silence were ridiculed. Each insult seemed carefully crafted, designed to remind Daniel that in the teacher's eyes, he was destined to remain small. Many children would have broken under that constant assault, withdrawing into quiet obscurity. But Daniel, though wounded, carried within him a stubborn ember that refused to be extinguished. At home, when the noise of the world finally quieted, Daniel's battle continued. He would sit at the rickety wooden table, his textbooks spread open like maps to a hidden future. By the faint light of a candle, he copied problems again and again, whispering solutions to himself until they became second nature. Every answer written correctly was like driving a nail into the coffin of the words that haunted him. "You'll never rise." He studied until his eyelids drooped, until his fingers ached from gripping the pencil, until the candle melted into nothing. The pain of humiliation turned into fuel, anger reshaped into determination. Still, doubt lingered like a shadow. Outside of school, the world echoed Crowder's prejudice. Neighbors looked at him and saw less, not more. Opportunities slipped away before they even reached him. Sometimes, late at night, staring at the blank pages of his notebook, Daniel would wonder if maybe his teacher was right. What if the path ahead truly was blocked? What if no amount of studying, no amount of fighting, could ever change his fate? Those were the darkest moments, the moments when silence felt like defeat. And yet, even then, he whispered to himself the promise he had made: I will prove him wrong. Over time, the promise hardened into a mantra. Every dawn when he opened his books, he whispered it. Every evening when exhaustion threatened to drag him under, he whispered it again. Those 4 words became a shield. They protected him when the laughter grew too loud, when the insults dug too deep, when the loneliness felt unbearable. He was no longer just studying for grades. He was preparing for survival, building an invisible armor that no cruelty could pierce. It was a lonely struggle, one few saw and even fewer understood. Classmates mocked him for working too hard. Some whispered that he was wasting his time, that he would always be exactly where he started. But Daniel clung to his vision of something greater. He didn't know what shape it would take, but he knew it existed. A future where his worth would not be dictated by a cruel teacher or a prejudiced community. The humiliation had given him a wound, yes, but it had also given him a weapon: the unbreakable will to rise. Years flowed by, carrying Daniel from the narrow, suffocating classroom of his childhood into new spaces where possibility shimmered like light breaking through clouds. When he earned a scholarship to study at a prestigious academy, many in his hometown muttered that it was a mistake, that boys like him weren't built for such places. Daniel heard their doubts, and instead of shrinking, he carried them like firewood to feed his determination. He would not fail, not because he wanted to silence them, but because he had made a promise to himself. He would never again be the boy who stood trembling with chalk in hand. At the academy, the challenges multiplied. The competition was fierce, the expectations towering, and prejudice followed him even there. Some professors dismissed him before he even opened his mouth, assuming he was less capable, less sharp, less worthy. But Daniel had grown accustomed to being underestimated. Rather than breaking under pressure, he thrived in it. He rose before dawn to study, filled notebooks with endless calculations, and trained his mind the way athletes train their bodies, with discipline, endurance, and unrelenting focus. As the semesters passed, something began to shift. The same professors who once overlooked him now paused to listen when he spoke. They could not deny the brilliance of his arguments or the clarity of his ideas. His classmates, at first indifferent, began to seek his help, drawn to his quiet strength and tireless work ethic. Daniel was no longer the silent boy hiding under the weight of shame. He was becoming a leader, though he did not yet see himself that way. What he did see was the power of persistence, the strength born of scars. Beyond his academic success, Daniel discovered another gift: the ability to speak in ways that moved others. It began modestly with class debates, where his speeches carried a conviction that silenced even his detractors. He spoke not from arrogance, but from lived pain, and people felt it. His voice, once choked by humiliation, grew steady, clear, and commanding. Each time he spoke, he carried not only his story, but the unspoken stories of countless others who had been told they were not enough. His words gave them courage, and in return, their silent support gave him strength. But the higher he climbed, the stronger the resistance grew. There were whispers that he was reaching too far, that he didn't belong in the circles he was entering. Some students sabotaged his work, jealous of his rising reputation. Even outside campus, strangers mocked his presence, unable to accept that someone like him could excel. Yet Daniel's response was always the same. He worked harder. He had already endured the worst humiliation of his life. Nothing else could crush him. Every obstacle became another stepping stone, every insult another layer of armor. One pivotal moment came during a public debate at the academy. Daniel stood before a crowded hall, nerves humming beneath his calm expression. His opponent mocked him, trying to belittle his background. But Daniel used the moment to turn the insult into a rallying cry. He declared that intelligence had no race, no class, no boundary, that the human spirit, once determined, could not be chained. His words thundered through the hall, and when the audience erupted in applause, he realized something profound. His pain had become his power. What once silenced him now gave him the ability to move hearts, to change minds, to inspire. That night, Daniel understood that he was not just surviving, he was rising. Years later, Daniel's name carried weight. He had grown into a man respected across the nation, his voice echoing in halls of power, his influence reaching classrooms, communities, and beyond. He had built programs for underprivileged children, championed reforms in education, and inspired countless young people to believe that their future was greater than their circumstances. Yet despite his achievements, one shadow lingered in the back of his mind, the voice of Mr. Crowder, the teacher who had once humiliated him into silence. Though time had dulled the sting, the memory never left him. One day, fate brought Daniel back to the very town he had left behind. He was invited to deliver a keynote speech at a local event celebrating leadership and resilience. When he walked into the hall, memories flooded back. The cracked pavements, the small school, the faces that had once looked down on him. But now the eyes that turned toward him were filled with admiration, respect, even awe. He had returned not as the timid boy mocked in front of a chalkboard, but as a man whose voice carried across nations. And yet in the crowd, one face stood out. Sitting in the back row was an older, frailer man. His posture was bent, his hair thin and gray, his once commanding presence diminished by time. But Daniel knew him instantly. Mr. Crowder, the same man who had sneered at him, the same man who had reduced him to silence in front of laughing classmates. The sight of him struck Daniel like a lightning bolt, an entire lifetime folding in on itself in one instant. He felt the echoes of shame, the weight of the past, the child still trembling with chalk in hand. But alongside it came a stronger truth. He was no longer that child. Daniel delivered his speech with fire and grace, speaking of resilience, of turning pain into strength, of rising above those who seek to chain you with their words. His voice carried through the hall, and the audience listened with rapt attention. Some wept, others applauded with fervor. He spoke as a man who had lived what he preached, and as his final words settled into the silence, the crowd rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Among them, Daniel's eyes locked once more with Crowder's. The teacher's face was unreadable, his lips pressed into a thin line. After the event, as people crowded around Daniel to shake his hand, Crowder slowly approached. The years had stripped him of arrogance, but not of pride. He looked at Daniel with eyes that still tried to pierce, though their power had waned. "I did not think you would come this far," he said quietly, almost grudgingly. It was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement, reluctant and heavy. Daniel stood tall, meeting the gaze without fear. For a moment, the air thickened, the past and present colliding. Then Daniel spoke, his voice steady and calm. "That day you tried to break me. You gave me my reason to fight. You may have thought you were humiliating me, but you were forging me." His words landed with the weight of truth, and for the first time, Crowder looked away. There was no triumph in Daniel's tone, no bitterness, only clarity. The balance of power had shifted forever. The teacher who once sought to define him now stood diminished before the man who had redefined himself. And in that moment, Daniel knew the shadow had finally lost its hold. After that unforgettable encounter with his former teacher, Daniel carried a strange mix of emotions within him. He did not feel hatred or revenge. He did not even feel triumph. What he felt was liberation. The boy who once walked out of a classroom drowning in shame had returned as a man who no longer bowed to the weight of another's judgment. That single confrontation with Crowder had not been about proving anything to him. It had been about closing a chapter. For Daniel, the story no longer belonged to the teacher who tried to break him. It belonged to the child who refused to stay broken. As the years passed, Daniel's influence only grew. He became more than a scholar or a leader. He became a symbol. To the poor, he was proof that opportunity could rise from adversity. To the oppressed, he was proof that the voice of one could ignite courage in many. Newspapers began to tell his story, weaving it into speeches and articles that traveled far beyond the borders of his homeland. People marveled not only at his accomplishments, but at the resilience that had carried him there. What they admired most was that his story was not born in privilege or luck, but in struggle that mirrored their own. He often visited schools, walking through corridors that reminded him of his own painful beginnings. Standing before classrooms filled with eager eyes, He told his story with raw honesty. He never concealed the cruelty of his former teacher or the humiliation he endured. But instead of bitterness, he spoke with clarity and hope. "You may be told you are not enough," he would say, "but the only voice that matters in the end is the one inside you. That voice must never be silenced." Children who once feared raising their hands in class now found courage in his word. Teachers who had grown careless in their responsibilities were reminded of the power they held, both to destroy and to uplift. Daniel's impact extended beyond education. He became a driving force in political reform, fighting for laws that ensured children from disadvantaged communities had access to resources, mentors, and opportunities that once seemed impossible to him. His speeches moved crowds, not because they were filled with lofty promises, but because they were rooted in truth. He spoke as someone who had lived the pain of being overlooked, dismissed, and mocked, and who had clawed his way toward dignity. Every policy he pushed forward, every reform he fought for, was stamped with the determination of a man who refused to let others suffer what he once endured. And yet, with all his power, Daniel never forgot the boy he used to be. Late at night, after the applause faded and the halls of power emptied, he would sit alone with his thoughts. He remembered the sting of laughter, the heat of shame, and the crushing silence of isolation. Those memories, though painful, kept him grounded. They reminded him why he fought, not for recognition, not for pride, but for the children whose voices trembled the way his once had. He carried their silent hopes like a torch, determined to keep the flame burning no matter how dark the world became. As Daniel's legacy grew, people often asked him what moment had shaped him most. Was it the scholarship that opened the doors of opportunity? Was it the debates where he first found his voice? Was it the reforms that reshaped his nation? Daniel always answered the same way. "It was the day I was humiliated in front of a classroom. That day, I was told I would never rise." Those words branded me, haunted me, but they also became my reason to fight. Without them, I would not be who I am today. It was a paradox that the cruelty meant to crush him had instead created a fire that burned brighter than anything his teacher could have imagined. Over time, his story became more than history. It became legend. Parents whispered it to their children at bedtime, urging them to believe in themselves even when the world said otherwise. Teachers repeated it to remind themselves of their responsibility to build, not break. Activists carried it into rallies, chanting Daniel's words as banners waved above their heads. His journey from humiliation to triumph became a beacon for those lost in the shadows of doubt. It told them that pain could be transformed, that scars could become strength, and that destiny could be forged in fire. Looking back on his life, Daniel knew one truth above all: greatness is not born from ease, but from struggle. His story was proof that words could wound, but they could also awaken something unstoppable. What began as a cruel attempt to break a child had instead unleashed a leader who changed the course of countless lives. The cycle of humiliation had been shattered, replaced with a cycle of hope, and as long as his story lived on, no child would ever again have to believe that shame was the end of their journey. If you were moved by Daniel's journey from humiliation to triumph, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience, courage, and transformation. Because sometimes, the stories born in the darkest classrooms shine the brightest in the world.